Hello and welcome back to another web development project. I guarantee you are going to find this modal tutorial useful, as we're not just going to be toggling a class on and off from some HTML markup. Instead, we're going to be writing a customizable JavaScript modal which can be reused across multiple projects. This is the pro way of doing it by keeping the modal functions and the app functions completely separate. And by the end of the tutorial, you're going to be comfortable working with ES6 classes, promises, and much more. So let's get started. So we're going to want to keep our code for our modal in separate files so that it can be reused on other pages. So in our project, what we've got set up at the moment is we've got a page.css and a page.js file, which is all code that's relevant to the page we're working on. So we're going to create a couple more files which will load into the page, but this will all be to do with the modal, and you can actually take this and use it in different pages and different projects later on as well. So the first thing we're going to need to have is a JavaScript file for the modal, and we're also going to need some styles for that as well. So we'll create a modal.css file as well. And in our index page, let's actually just link those two assets into the page that we're working on. So we've got the modal.css as well. And also we want to put in the modal.js file as well. And notice this has got to come before we load the page.js file, because we want to make sure that the code that we're writing for the modal is available when we start using it in the actual page itself. So there you go, we've got those files set up. Let's actually put something on the page so that we can start working and creating the modal. And all we're going to do for this page is to put a button on the page that we can actually trigger the modal with. So for our HTML, we're just going to have a button and just say open modal for the text. And I will give it an ID as well so we can target it. So the button ID will be open modal. And with that button in place, we're going to put a bit of style into the page.css, just so we're not working on a blank white page, and just so we've got something a bit more interesting to look at. And all we're going to do is just target the body of the page as well, and just put a linear gradient onto here. So we'll set the background property of the body tag to be linear gradient. And I've just pulled up a website, UI Gradients, pretty cool website that just gives you lots of different UI gradient combinations that you can use. And I like this blue one here, so I'm just going to take the hex codes from here to create our gradient. And we'll just get it going to the right. So we'll start with that dark blue color, and then we'll go to the lighter blue color. And if we go back to our page now, we've got that gradient on the page for us. And the only other thing that we've got on the page is the button. So we're just going to target the open modal button, and I'm going to give it a bigger font size. I'm going to use 2 rem. Set the background color to be white, padding to be 1 rem, take off the border off it, and also just give it a bit of box shadow as well, so there's a little bit of a glow behind it. 24 pixels, RGBA, and we'll use a white color to give it a kind of glow. It's a bit cheesy, but we just need a big button that we can click and actually trigger the modal from. And that's pretty much all of the styles that we need for our page. Obviously, if you're working on some other project, you could just slot this button in somewhere and style it however you like. But before we go on and look at the modal, another bit of setup we're going to do is just in the page.js file. So for the moment, all I'm going to do is just target the element that we've got on the page, the button element, which has an ID of open modal. And I'm just going to add an event listener, and of course the event listener is the click event listener. And the only thing we really need to do with this at the moment is just to register that it's actually being clicked. So I'm just going to say console.log modal button clicked. And we'll just check that's working. We'll open up our console here in Chrome. And when we click the button, you can see we're getting that message in the console. So the actual button is hooked up to the event listener, and we're going to use this to actually trigger our modal code once we've created it. So how are we actually going to create and use this modal code? Because don't forget, we want to keep using this in other projects, so to make this code as reusable as possible. Well, we're going to do it in 2 steps. We'll create an object here. So we'll create a modal object. And from this creation process, we'll pass in some information such as the title and any text that we want, and also the button labels as well. And once that object is created, we can then use it in this page.js file. So here where we're triggering the actual button click, we can then open the modal from here and then also take any further actions depending on what the user clicks in the actual modal itself. So taking that feedback and then doing something more useful in your page. So we're going to keep things absolutely separate, so the modal itself will just pop up on the page and then you'll click one of the buttons and then that's it, the modal's done. It doesn't need to think about anything else or know about anything else in the page or app. So that's the basic framework for it. We're now in a position where we can go over to the modal.js file and actually start coding up the modal. So I'm going to open that up now, and I'll also keep the modal.css file handy there as well, because we'll be coding some styles in there as we go along. And I think the best approach for this modal is to actually create a class, an ES6 class, which has all of the information provided in the constructor, and then has several different methods that can be used to open and close and actually create the modal content and elements itself. So if you've never created a class in ES6 before, you simply use the class keyword and then just give it a name. So I'm going to call our modal awesome modal. And then we're going to create a constructor function, which is actually called when we create a new instance of this class. And you'll see how that works in just a second. But I can pass basically different information into this constructor, which we're going to do in the page.js file, as we mentioned a moment ago. And so the information that we're going to pass in, we're just going to pass in one object into the constructor, and that's going to have several different properties. So I'm going to destructure them here from the constructor function. So we'll have a title text property, a message text property, so there'll be a main heading and then some more information underneath it, and then there'll be some more text for the confirm button, and finally some cancel text as well, which will be if the user chooses not to accept whatever it is we're asking them to do. And with this constructor function, we can actually create some properties on the object when it's created. And this is a little bit repetitive in JavaScript here, but we can essentially assign all of the properties that are coming from this object that's been passed into the constructor into the actual object that's created itself. So we're going to have message text is equal to message text, and confirm text is equal to confirm text, and this dot cancel text is equal to cancel text. So that's just our first bit of setup for the modal that's been created, and we can test that out in the page.js file. And so remember here we said we were going to create one of these modal objects and pass in all of the information. Well, we can do that now by saying we're going to be creating a confirm modal, and then we'll just say it's equal to a call to new awesome modal. And we just pass in that object with all of the different properties, as you can see Visual Studio Code is telling us here. So title text, I will just say, are you sure? And the message that's going to be displayed under that is going to say something like this: action cannot be undone. And then for the two buttons that we've got, well, the confirm text will say absolutely, and for the cancel text, we'll just say no. And we'll just log that out to the console as well, so you can see what that looks like with the object that it creates. You should find over here in the console when it reloads that we've got a object of type awesome modal, and it's got all those properties inside there. So it's literally just the same as a normal JavaScript object, and you can access each of those individual properties such as cancel text, confirm text, and we're going to make use of that throughout the rest of the modal code. So the next step really is to get something to appear on the page, and we're going to build this up bit by bit so you can see it evolving rather than just coding the entire modal class all in one go. But what I'm going to do next is actually create a function which will actually open the modal on the page, but we need to create lots of elements as well for that, and we're going to do that all in our JavaScript. And this goes back to the idea of not putting it all into your markup because it's difficult to edit in there and it's specific to that one page. If we create it all in our JavaScript, then we can reuse this code on any other page that we work on. So this function, I'm going to call it create and open. And I'm going to create a div element, which is going to be basically a black overlay over the page, which will kind of hide the existing contents on the page and just focus the user on the modal. And this is just going to be the base of where we're going to add everything else as well in the modal. So I'm going to add a new property onto the object that's created called modal lem, and that is equal to a create element call, and we're going to create a div. And then we're going to add a class as well. So as mentioned, we're going to keep the CSS separate in the modal.css file. So on the class list, we're going to add the class of modal. And of course, to get this on the page that we're actually running this code on, we need to access the document and append the modal lem that we've just created here onto our page, and we're going to have a look at the CSS for this now so that we can actually get something on the page so we can see this working. So we're adding a class of modal, so let's target the modal class. So I'm going to set the background color to be a really dark black with some opacity, so you can kind of see something through the actual overlay that we're placing on here. And you would probably in reality not use such a dark opaque color because you'd probably want to see a bit more of the content, but I'm just doing this for effect so we can focus exactly on the content that we're putting up on the page. A lot of this is down to how you want the actual modal to appear, so you can be a bit creative with it. But I'm going to put it as a fixed position because we don't want it moving around on the page. And then for its positioning, I'm going to set the top to be 0, bottom to be 0, left to be 0, and also right to be 0, which basically means this overlay element will span the entirety of the page and we'll get a black covering everywhere on the user's content. So we're going to set the display property here to flex for the reason that we're going to justify the actual content, the modal window rather than the overlay in the center of the page. So justify content and align items to be centered. And initially we're going to set this to have an opacity of 0, so it's basically hidden on the page. And then we're going to put a transition property on here of changing the opacity to 0.4 seconds. And this will give us a fade in effect when the modal is actually added onto the page. And so we'll do that by adding an additional class when we're ready to open the modal, which is modal open, and set the opacity equal to 1. So we can actually get this onto the page now and start to build up our modal. The first step is to actually, in our page.js file, actually call the function to actually add the modal to the page. And we're going to do that when the user clicks the button. So from here, we're going to, from the confirm modal, which is an instance of the awesome modal, got a function on there called create and open. So we're just going to call that from here. And if we save that and go back to our page and actually run the code again by clicking the button, what we'll find is we don't see that overlay appearing, but we can actually see the element being created on the page. And that's because we haven't added the other class, the open class, make the modal display because it's got an opacity of 0 to start off with. And we're going to do that again in this create and open function. But we just need to wait a tiny bit of time for the DOM to catch up and to actually add that on before we add the class. So we need to add the open class onto this modal element as well. Here we're adding the modal class. But if we do it up here, we have a bit of a problem because the class is added automatically before it's added into the document. And so the opacity will be set as 1, so we don't get that fade effect, although we should find that the modal is displaying. So we need to set a little timeout and just wait a few milliseconds before we add that open class onto the actual element, because it'll just give it a chance to actually be added into the document with an opacity of 0, and then it'll fade in to 1 once the class has been applied. So we could just set a timeout here, and the function we're going to run is pretty much this. Add in the class list, but we're going to add the class of open. And how long are we going to wait? Well, it shouldn't matter too much, but let's just say, for argument's sake, the transition's 400 milliseconds, so we'll wait 400 milliseconds here as well. So now you can see when we click the open modal button, we get a nice fade effect because we're starting off the element on the page with an opacity of 0, and we're fading it in by adding the open class 400 milliseconds later. So the next thing we need to do is to add all of the other content onto the page, the title, the message, and the buttons. And this is a bit of a slog doing it in JavaScript this way because we need to create all of the elements individually, but it does mean that we don't have to put any markup into our HTML at all. So bear with me while we go through this because it might take a bit of time just to kind of create all of these elements, but I'll try and do my best with my copy and paste skills to speed this up. So we're going to first of all create a modal content element. And we're going to have document.create element of div. So basically this is going to be the container, the like white box on the page that has the rest of the content in here. So we're going to add a class of content. And with that created, we can append that to the modal lem. So this is the main overlay that we've got on the page at the moment. And it's the modal content lem. So with that element now on the page, when the modal is opened, if we just click the button, we should see it inside of here. Now we've got that content element. We can actually add some more information in there. So the information we passed in to the constructor function. So what we want to do for starters is to put the title in there as well. So I'm going to create a new element called title text lm, and I'm going to use a p tag for that, and I'm going to set the title text element dot class list to be just title text. And because we've passed in the content and it's available on the class of this dot title text, we can then say the title text lm dot text content is equal to this dot title text. And if we make sure that's added to the modal content element, it should start appearing on the page as well for us. So modal content element dot append child and the title text element. So if we try clicking the open button again, you can see we've got our modal element on there, and there's content, and we've also got title text in there as well. It is on the page. I think it's probably got black text. You can't actually see it because it's so dark. So we're going to fix that in our CSS. In fact, let's go over there now and actually start coding that up so you can kind of see how that's going to look. So we're going to target the modal .content class that we've got, and we'll set the font family to be sans serif. You can choose anything you like here really. And we'll set the background color to be a plain white. There we go, you can see the text on the page already. We'll set a border radius of 6 pixels. We make sure that the text is aligned in the center of the modal content. And then we'll also set some padding of 4 rems. So you may have noticed that I've been using rems throughout this project so far, and that is because we want to keep everything relative to the base font size that's been put in the page. So this should just help it make it a little bit more responsive and a little bit more in line with the rest of the content that's on the page. And if the font size of the main page does change, then hopefully our modal should stay roughly in line with that. So what else do we need to do here? So we're just going to put a box shadow, which is kind of optional, but it'll just give a bit of a glow around the modal content that we've got here. So again, just using a white color and 0.2 for the opacity. So there's just a slight fade on that. It's probably a bit cheesy again, but something you can tweak for your own custom implementation when you get around to making this. So we did actually add in the title text, and there's a class for that. So we've got title text, and we'll set the font weight to be 900 and the font size to be 2 rems. There you go, we've got a nice big title for our modal now. So we're in a position where we can start adding in the rest of the content as well. So this is where my cut and paste skills will come into play, because we're pretty much just doing the same thing over and over again, but just for different elements. So for the next one, so this is going to be for the heading. Then we want to put in the message. So instead of title text lm, I'm just going to change this to message text lm, and then just make sure we're adding that onto the content that we've already got on there. So let's just test we've done that right. Let's click open modal, and we can see the message element is being populated there now. And the only other thing we've got in here are really some buttons as well. So we'll add those in, but I can pretty much copy and paste this again. So for the first one, we're going to put the cancel button in first. So we'll say cancel button text lm, and this time it's not going to be a p tag, it's going to be a button, so make sure we change that. And it wasn't cancel button text that we were passing in, it was cancel text in the constructor up here, so make sure we get that right. And then we can just copy this again, and instead of cancel this time we're going to have confirm, so we should just be able to find all of the cancel words from here and then just replace that with confirm. And let's see how that works, see if I've made some mistakes here. Okay, so at least we've got 2 buttons, and you can see they're appearing just as you would expect them to there, so that's good, that's a good start. We should be in a position where we can go and finish off our CSS now for the modal. So we put a rule in for the title text. Let's just make sure we've got something in there for the message text as well. So the only thing I'm going to do there is just put some margin on the top and bottom, just to make sure everything's spread out nicely. But the main things we want to focus on here are the buttons that are inside of the content of our modal. So I'm going to set a width property here of 40%, just so they take up as much space as they can. within the modal layout that we've got. And I'll also add some padding on there, and we'll start the padding, we'll say 0.75 rem, just so the buttons are a bit chunkier. But I will put some margin on that as well. And I'll use a margin value of just 5 pixels, just so there's a little bit of a gap between them. Set the text color of the buttons to be white. I'm going to change the border, remove that to be 0, and I'm going to use the same border radius that we had on the modal content as well, so we'll say 6 pixels again. And then I just want to target each of those buttons individually to give them a different background color. So we'll target the modal content button, and we have cancel button text for the cancel button, and same for confirm. So let's just set up the rules for these two here. And for the cancel button, we'll just set it as a background color of red. And for the confirm, a background color of green. And they're quite garish, those built-in colors, so I'm just going to kind of take it down a notch here and just make it a bit more of a pastel-y sort of red color there. And then we'll also go for the green, maybe a bit lighter. So it's still not great, but it looks a bit better. So let's take stock of where we are at the moment. So we've got our modal set up, and it's linked to that button on the page, and we can trigger it. We can get the modal to open, and we've got the 2 buttons and all of the content inside of there. But obviously clicking the buttons doesn't actually do anything at the moment. And that's the whole point of this project really, is so that we can customize the behavior of the modal and do some specific task that is contained within our page.javascript file rather than something that's built into the modal itself. And there are different ways that we could do this, but the solution that I think is best for this custom modal behavior is to actually use a promise. So with a promise, we can actually wait for some action, for some asynchronous job to be done. And in this case, the asynchronous action that's waiting to be done is the user clicking one of those buttons. So if we actually return a promise from our awesome modal class, in our main page in our JavaScript, we can actually then hook into that promise using either async or await or a promise chain. And then the actions that we're actually going to do will be in the page JavaScript and not hard-coded into our modal code. So what we're actually trying to do here in our page.js file is take this further action. So we're opening the modal at the moment. And what we're looking to do is when the users said yes to the actual modal that's popped up, we can then use the then block to do something else. So we'll say then we can do something else from here. But if they say no, or if there's a problem, we can actually catch an error and then do something else. And we can recognize that the users clicked a different button. So that's what we're aiming to do. So we need to go back into our modal.js file to actually create a promise and actually return it from one of these functions. So to do that in our modal.js file, I'm actually going to first of all create a new function outside of this create and open function that we've already got. And I'm just going to call it simply open, because that will make most sense when we're calling it from our page.js file. And all we're going to do from here is return a new promise. And when you construct a new promise, you get access to 2 functions, I guess they are, inside of the promise constructor, and they are resolve and reject. So what I'm going to do when we create the new promise is then call the function of create and open, and I'm going to pass in both the resolve and the reject functions that are available on the promise. So we go back up into this create and open function, and this is where we're going to accept the resolve and reject functions that are passed in. So we could say resolve reject here, but we can actually rename them because they're arguments to this function. So I'm going to rename them to something a bit more meaningful to this function. So I'm going to say when the user's confirmed, then we're going to call this function, or if they cancelled, we'll call this function. And they're the resolve and the reject functions still, but I've just renamed them here. So we're going to call these when the user clicks either the cancel or the confirm buttons, and we're just going to do that by setting up event listeners on both of those respective buttons. So we'll do that just down here for the cancel button. So for the cancel button text element, I'm going to add an event listener, and it's going to be for click events. So when the user actually clicks this button, what we want to do is actually call the reject function that we've passed in, which we've renamed as on cancel. And we can pass some text back as well. So I'm just going to say cancelled. But you'll see in a moment that this doesn't really matter too much with this approach that we're using. And then we just do a similar thing for the confirm button as well. So when we're setting that up here, so the confirm button text element dot add event listener of click. And what we'll do in here instead, we'll say, instead of on cancel, we'll say on confirm. And again, we'll just pass back a message, but we don't need to. And so each of those buttons now will call part of that promise for us, which has been passed in as arguments. So how does that look when we actually use it within our page.js file? Well, there's a couple of changes that we need to make. Instead of calling create and open, we just want to call open this time. And you can see here in Visual Studio Code, it's telling me that this is actually returning a promise. So what we're going to do is we're going to say for the then block, and we can access the value that's passed back. Just say console.log user clicked confirm, and I'll just show you that value as well. And we can do the same thing for the catch block as well. So we'll say catch any errors that come back, and we'll say user clicked cancel and the value. Okay, so what should happen now when we open the modal is we get our two buttons on the page. And depending on which one we click, we should see a response in the console telling us what's happened. So if we click the confirm button, for example, you can see the then block of our promise has been triggered, and we can see that the message has come out saying the user's clicked confirm with the value that was passed back, which was success. And if we try that again and click no, you can see this time we get the user clicked cancel, and we're actually triggering this catch part of our promise. So that's pretty cool because it means that we've taken out the logic of what happens when the user clicks either no or absolutely within our modal, and we've put that inside of the current page or app that we're working on, and it's completely separate from the code which actually handles the modal. So we're nearly there with our awesome modal, but we actually aren't getting the modal closing when we're clicking one of the buttons, so that's the final thing that we need to do. So I'm going to create a close function which we can call inside of our modal class when either button is clicked. So we'll just put that down here next to open. So we'll say close, and we'll just say this modal element dot class list dot remove open, which will fade out the modal contents and show us what's underneath it. But we also want to remove all of the modal elements as well, just so we don't have things hanging around. And we need to do something similar to what we did when we open the modal, and that's to wait for the transition to finish and then actually remove all the elements. So we'll set up another set timeout here, and that will be equal to document.body.remove child this.modal element, and we'll give it again, we'll wait 400 milliseconds. We probably need to do that here because the transition takes about that long anyway, so we'll just save that. And then here, when we're calling the promise functions, either resolve or reject, we want to make sure we close the modal after that, or after that's been called. So we'll do that here. And what we should find now, if we open the modal and click either of the buttons, we should get that promise still resolving or rejecting, and then the modal should close, which indeed it does. So you can see this is a lot more work than just putting in some content on the page and then toggling an open and closed class to actually show and hide it, but it's so much more flexible, and it makes this code reusable, and you can use it in many other projects and customize it to how you like. And of course we can pass in any other details from here as well. So if we do change our mind on any of the text, it can all be controlled within our JavaScript. So we could say something like, do you really want to log out? And change the message text as well. You will need to sign in again, and then we can change the button text as well. So we'll say log out or cancel. And now we've got a completely different modal in here as well, with some completely different text in there. And of course we can customize this promise chain as well to do different things. So when the user clicks to log out, we can call our logout function or whatever we've got that does the logout for us in this instance. Or if we get to this point in the promise chain where the user's clicked cancel, then we could just do nothing from here because they want to stay logged in. It really does depend on how you want to use the modal in the page or the app where you have it set up, and this just gives you a way to customize the behavior in a really simple way. And of course you can keep going with this modal as well. We could keep actually making more customizations. So one thing I was thinking about when setting this up earlier was that we could actually change the way the modal appears depending on what text is provided. So for example, we might not want to provide a cancel button. So we always want the user to confirm and to proceed to the next point. So we could say something along the lines of, rather than do you want to log out, we could say you have been logged out. So we could say you have been logged out, and just change that to OK, for example. And then if we don't pass that value in the constructor, we could hide this button. So for example, we could go into the modal.js from here. And a really quick way to hide all of this would be to only create this cancel button if this.cancel text has actually been provided. So we could just in here, just to demonstrate that. There's probably better ways that we could set this up, but just as a quick example for you. So now this cancel button will only be created if this.cancel text has been provided in the constructor. And we should find here now that because we didn't provide cancel text in our page.js file, when we're creating the actual awesome modal class, we've only got the one button available. So you've been logged out. Okay, I'll carry on. And the promise chain continues, and then we can do something else with the user, for example, redirecting them to the login page. So when you're creating these bits of code that are going to be reused on other web pages, it's really important to try and get them to be as responsive as possible. And if you want to learn more about making responsive components, then you should check out this next tutorial where we're going to be creating a responsive navbar that reacts to the different screen sizes that it's loaded on. But that's it for this tutorial. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.